My life and the purpose of my life has everything to do with books and reading, helping myself and others find our next good books. And my definition of a good book is very simple. A good book is a book that I enjoy. A good book for you is a book that you enjoy. We might agree that a particular book is good because we both enjoyed it, or we might differ because there's no predicting anything with reading and with books. I believe that reading is about experiencing joy and that you learn something about yourself and the world with every book that you read, whether it's a romance, a biography, or the latest literary novel, which is why I invented the rule of 50 in order to allow people to guiltlessly give up on a book they're not enjoying, unless it's a class assignment or it's for your book club. Then you have to read it all the way through. Basically, the rule of 50 is, and this will apply to most of you who are under the age of 50 here, if you're under 50, give a book 50 pages. At the bottom of page 50, ask yourself, am I really enjoying this book? If you are, go on and read it to the end. If all you care about is who got married to whom or who the murderer was, skip to the last page. There are many things that our government can find out about us, but no one will ever be able to know if we've returned a book to the library without having read every single page. Now, many of us spend too much time, I think, and emotional energy trying to live up to the reading Joneses, instead of regarding our own likes and dislikes of books as being perfectly valid as anybody else's opinions about them. So when I'm not playing Angry Birds on my iPad or Plants vs. Zombies on my computer, I obsessively think about why people like the books they like. And my preoccupation with this question, I think, grew out of a decade of book selling and the many years of being a librarian that bracketed that experience. Now, a woman once came into the bookstore where I was working in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and told me that her preteen daughter was not a reader and that she, the mother, really wanted some suggestions for books that would help her daughter learn to love reading. She told me that her English professor at TU had insisted that her daughter would learn to love to read by reading the classic novels. Hemingway, Fitzgerald, Hawthorne, Wharton, Woolf. Hearing this, my heart sank. I said to the mother something like, those are all wonderful authors and they've written wonderful novels, but I wonder if we could possibly find a book whose subject matches one of your daughter's interests or is geared more directly to her age group. Oh no, the mother said. I really want her to read the classics. I sold her The Age of Innocence, knowing all the while that as a result of that, I could probably list her daughter among those fallen or lost readers. In both bookstores and libraries these days, a common scenario consists of a patron or a customer coming up to the librarian or bookseller and saying, can you help me? I just read this wonderful novel, and I want another one just like it. Even today, when I get asked that question, or even a question like, so what have you been reading lately, Nancy, at a dinner party, or if I'm sitting at Starbucks drinking my, what is it called, the hot tea. Well, it has a name before the phrase hot tea. Awake tea. If I'm at a dinner party or at Starbucks drinking my venti cup of awake tea, or sitting next to somebody on the plane and that person would say to me, what are you reading? I'll tell you what happens. I break out in a cold sweat, my stomach clenches, and the name and author of every book I've ever read immediately flies out of my head. So what I've been forced to do so as not to totally embarrass myself whenever I leave the house is to write the names of 3 books on the back of my hand, so I can surreptitiously look down and tell people what I've been reading. So in case you want to ask me later, there are the 3 books. So how do we even begin to help that reader find his or her own next good book? A seemingly commonsensical way is to match up the book the patron has just read with other books that might have the same general topic or that fall into the same genre. So if the book that somebody comes up and says something like, I just finished Moby Dick, greatest book I ever read, I want another book just like it, we can, like shut our mouth where our jaw has dropped open and, say, oh, really? Okay. And we can look up other books, fiction or nonfiction, on 19th century whaling expeditions, or life on commercial fishing fleets, or other novels that are examples of American romanticism. Similarly, if someone comes in and says, I love the novels of P.D. James featuring Inspector Adam Dalgleish, I want some more mysteries just like those, we could take that person over to the mystery section in the bookstore or the library. In both instances, what we're doing is making a connection based on what the book is about. But when we link up books with readers by considering what the books are about, the details of the plots, I think we're really misunderstanding what goes on in our reading lives. That mother in the bookstore in Tulsa, or goodness knows, her Tulsa University professor, wasn't trying to comprehend the life interests or the experiences of that preteen reluctant reader. They were trying to fit her into a category of books deemed to be important ones. So when we want a book, when we say, or when we desire to read a book exactly like the one we just finished reading, what we want to do is to replicate or recreate a pleasurable experience that we've had. That headlong rush to the last page, that falling into a character's life, the deeper understanding we might have gotten of a place or a particular time, or the feeling of reading words that are put together in a way that causes us to look at the world in a different way. Having spent years, decades really, listening to readers describing books in terms of their own experiences reading them, has led me to believe that we need to change the way we think about putting people together with books. We need to start thinking about what it is about the book that draws us in, rather than what the book is about. I now believe that in all works of fiction and narrative nonfiction, every one of those books are made up of 4 experiential elements. I call these doorways because when you open a book, read a few pages, and decide to go on reading it, what you have done is chosen to enter the world of that book. These 4 doorways are story, character, setting, and language. A book with story as its biggest doorway is one that readers describe as being page-turning, that they couldn't put down, that they missed their bus stop because they were so engrossed in the book they were reading, and that they desperately wanted to discover what happened next. Readers describe a book in which character is the biggest doorway as one where the people they're reading about seem utterly real, that when the book was over, they feel they've lost someone dear to them because they'll never spend time with that character again. These readers who love character-driven books, I think, are like the woman described in Liz Moore's new novel, Heft, where the author describes her as judging the characters she encountered in novels as people rather than as literature. This to the disapproval of her professor. Now, readers of novels in which the setting doorway is the largest one say things like, I felt that I was there, I knew every street and shop of that town. Or as one man told me, when I finished Willa Cather's novel, Death Comes for the Archbishop, I immediately made plans to go to New Mexico. I had to see for myself where that book was set. People who have read and loved a book in which language is the biggest doorway will say things like, I'm not even sure what that book is about, but I loved the way the author wrote. Or, I kept reading slower and slower, and my heart kept beating faster and faster because I wanted to savor the language. Writer Pamela Aarons wrote that when she began to read language-driven books, books in which language is the biggest doorway, she says, I began to feel physically the difference between sentences that merely move the plot along and sentences that are a type of music and a conduit for the exploration of human character. But how do we make practical use of this concept of doorways to help ourselves or someone else find their next good book? First of all, we have to change metaphors. Put the notion of doorways out of your mind for a moment, set it aside, and think instead of a novel or a work of narrative nonfiction as a pie made up of those four elements: story, character, setting, and language. Or, better yet, and much less messy for cutting and serving, think of a pie chart. Each book of fiction or narrative nonfiction can be divided up into 4 pieces of varying sizes. Understanding a book by looking at these pieces of a pie chart, or a pie, gives us a way to understand why someone who loves the novels of Daniel Silva, Dan Brown, or Tom Clancy, those fast-paced thrillers that are often involved with the world of espionage or international intrigue, will probably not enjoy, or certainly not enjoy as much, John le Carré's spy novels, because Silva, Brown, Clancy all have huge story doorways. You're reading them to find out what happens next, while John le Carré's biggest doorway, if you think of a movie or a book like Tinker, Tailor, Soldier, Spy, John le Carré's biggest doorways are character and language. Looking at books this way makes clear why someone who loves the page-turning novels of Kristen Hanna might find Ann Tyler's character-driven novels slow and possibly tedious, thinking that those books by Tyler went nowhere but from one character's head to another. Take a look at the jackets of 2 novels influenced by the events at Columbine High School. One by Jodi Picoult called 19 Minutes, and one by Lionel Shriver called We Need to Talk About Kevin. One of them is story-driven, breathless, action-oriented, while the other is leisurely and written from the point of view of the mother of a teenage boy. You can almost tell from the titles of those books which is which. My dream is to have attached to every entry in an online catalog for a library or a bookstore a pie chart that's attached to every title that indicates its 2 biggest doorways, thereby offering readers an immediate visual representation of the book. Or why stop at the catalog? Wouldn't it be great to have a website or an app you could carry with you when you went looking for a good book? So that if you say, like the character-driven novels of Stuart Onan, you can pull up a visual representation of a number of books with character as the major doorway. Some that will have story as the second biggest doorway, some with setting as the second biggest doorway, some with language as the second biggest doorway. So in order to find your next good book, the trick is to find a matching pie chart to the book that you loved. And I actually think that this could be done in a not too difficult way if each reader, upon finishing a book, would create a pie chart and send it into a central location. That could be me. My experience has been that while we may differ on the actual numbers, the actual percentages of a particular book, you, for example, may think that Gabriel Garcia Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude is 70% language, 10% setting, 15% character, and 5% story, while I may think it's actually 60% language, 20% setting, 10% character, and 10% story. Nonetheless, we both would agree that people who love language-driven novels will probably be drawn to Garcia Marquez. We both agree that language by far is the biggest doorway. This way of thinking about books, the pie chart way, is underpinned by the definition of a good book that I offered at the beginning of this talk, that a good book is simply a book that one's enjoyed. Certainly, all the books that that English professor named are classics, but that definition, that way of describing a book, this book is a classic, to someone who is looking for a book to enchant or delight them, that's not going to tell them very much. Certainly, you can tell me that Hawthorne's A Scarlet Letter is a classic, and you could tell me that everyone should read it. But if I didn't enjoy it at all, what difference does the fact that it's considered a classic make to me, except maybe to make me feel guilty because I didn't like it and therefore I'm not a deep enough reader. Frankly, somebody who didn't find The Scarlet Letter particularly page-turning or enlightening or a good example of 19th century American fiction is not going to be impressed by the fact that when I read it, I'm just praying for the last page to come sooner rather than later. In other words, I'm really not sure that it makes sense to have an extrinsic evaluation that states that one book is better than another book. Looking at fiction and narrative nonfiction this way, via pie charts, I think allows us to blur the artificial distinctions between genres and between fiction and nonfiction. It gives us a way to open our world wider in pursuit of a good book to read. I think it's important to remember that Dewey's Decimal System was not written in stone. He did not bring his classification plan down from the mountain. In fact, centuries before Dewey, Francis Bacon divided the world of books into only 3 categories: history, imagination, and philosophy. Think what exciting things we could do with those divisions. Thinking about books the pie chart way, I believe, allows us to both narrow the world of literature to manageable proportions and also to have the optimum opportunity to find our next good book. Thank you.